is I Go Travel with Don Barnett. What was that noise we heard? I'll tell you a little later in the travel log. I found out that there's more than just polar bears to Churchill. There's Inuit, Metis, First Nation, beluga, aurora. Let's go find out about these things. We're in Churchill, Manitoba. Did you hear that sound a minute ago in the introduction? No, it's not the sound of one of those polar bears we've been watching. And no, it was not one of those foxes we saw running around parts of town before their coats turned a winter white. That was the sound of a beluga whale. They love to communicate a variety of sounds. That's why they're called the canaries of the ocean. They come to Churchill, but not when the polar bears are here. They usually come late spring and summer. All I saw of a beluga was this portrait on the wall of a government building in town. I just might have to make another trip here. And maybe even yet another trip to see the sky light up with the northern lights, or as the more science people call them, the aurora borealis. They show best in the dark sky of winter, and they're just much better to watch than some floating ice along the coast like I had to watch. Hunting and trapping still goes on, and we saw several hides hanging and drying throughout town. We went out near the airport to look at a transport plane that had crashed some years ago. It was just too remote and expensive to salvage a plane that was not going to ever fly again. The only real use it has now, besides a tourist attraction, is it does provide a hideout for some polar bears, so you have to be careful when you explore this old airplane site. Everyone wanted a photo beside this modern Inukshuk. These unique prehistoric Inuit stone piles may have had some religious meaning, but the more common theory is that they were built as landmarks or to channel caribou herds in a particular direction during hunts. We saw a few old Inuit sleds or komatiks, and we also saw several pups waiting to grow up and pull tourists around on dog sled rides. Various lodging is available in town, but we stayed on the old rocket range site at the Northern Studies Research Center. Modern building and absolutely great food and good sleep. If you got the lower bunk, I was first there, so I quickly wrote my name on the paper. The old fella who arrived later really struggled to climb in and out of the top bunk. But, you know, it's the early bird that gets the worm. One of the government buildings had this unique kids' slide in it. Several local tapestries like these hung from the ceiling. This non-plumb building shows the effect of ground freezing and thawing. Buildings are built on stilts to avoid the permafrost from thawing due to the heat from the buildings. But sometimes the permafrost wins anyhow and makes the buildings go off plumb. Harsh climate, small trees. Wind often freezes off branches on the side from where the wind is blowing. The wind, in this case, in this picture, the wind direction is from right to left. Okay, kids, here is your big test question. From what direction is the wind blowing in this picture? I noticed this rocket display at the research center and wondered what it was all about. A little later, I then noticed this rocket display outside. The rocket center, once at Churchill, was a joint Canada-U.S. effort that first tested the upper atmosphere. Over 3,500 test rockets were fired from Churchill. It was the forerunner of rockets that put up many satellites, put the man on the moon, and enabled us to establish the current space station. All of this started in Churchill, Manitoba, with their initial forerunner space program. In its day, it was a sizable program. Today, all of the buildings have been removed, and little remains of what was a very historic, pioneering venture. Let's just switch for a minute to a modern focus. Who are the people of Churchill today? What is their story? Let's look at the early European fur traders and the Aboriginal indigenous people who intersected at the crossroads of Churchill. Let's do some quick map work on the Europeans. The English first came into Hudson Bay and also down where the area of the eastern U.S. and Hudson River is today. The French, on the other hand, came into the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes areas. That's why Canada speaks two official languages today, French and English. It's also why the U.S. speaks mainly English today. As you move south, you can see where it was nearly all Spanish in the early conquest days. That's why much of the southern U.S., Mexico, most of Central and South America all speak Spanish. The only real exception is Brazil, that speaks Portuguese because the Portuguese went there in colonial times. We are all products in many ways of historical processes that occurred long before our time. Getting back to the English on Hudson Bay, they, along with the French, were after furs, mainly the beaver. For several hundred years, the main entry was right here through Churchill. This map shows the various main fur trade routes through Hudson Bay. It's a relatively forgotten place today, as we now mostly live near the warmer American border. The beaver and this one-time famous Hudson Bay blanket were the symbols of Canada. The Hudson Bay Company was the largest English company that handled nearly all the trade and development of early Canada over several hundred years. Churchill is a coming together kind of place. All three Aboriginal indigenous people identified in the Canadian Constitution have been an essential part of the Churchill story. We saw Inuit artifacts at the local museum. But remember, even in a museum, never turn your back on a polar bear. Here are some examples of some of the Inuit items that were for sale at the museum. Due to the decline in whaling activities, many Inuit have left Churchill to return to their more northern communities. These displays here struck me as being representative of First Nations people. There are many First Nation groups throughout Canada, and the Cree people who are in this area are the largest First Nation group in Canada. The canoe has been a hallmark cultural item for Northwoods people. This was another display in the museum that illustrated items used by First Nations people throughout history. The Métis are people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, and have been continual participants in Canada's story since the early fur trade days. We bought some items in this Métis lady's store. Around her waist, note that she is wearing a sash, which is a traditional part of Métis dress that originally was used as a back support during the long hours of paddling the historic canoe fur brigades. These brigades carried furs from far inland to waiting English ships on the coastline of Hudson Bay and elsewhere, mainly along Lake Superior and the other Great Lakes. The fiddle and the jig are integral parts of Métis music and dance. Okay, kids, here is your test question. Notice the intricate, beautiful beadwork on this moccasin that could have been beaded by either a Métis or a First Nations person. Okay, are you ready for the answer? Here it comes. Where are we going next with these travelogues? Well, hit the subscribe button and you'll get a notice when I put up the next travelogue or so. In the meantime, the season is over here in Churchill. I'll see you in the playoffs.